I'm Casey Brown. I'm a faculty member at the University of Massachusetts, and I'm chair of the Water and Society Committee under the hydrology section of the American Geophysical Union. And I'd like to welcome you to the session on water management. Probably, for those of you in the room, it probably doesn't need to be said, but nonetheless I'll say it anyway, that water management really is a foundation upon which things such as safe drinking water, crop production, food production, energy production, protection from floods and droughts, and the sustenance of ecosystems relies. And that in this way, good water management is essential to good civilization. And this is what we are in the room to talk about today. Some of you may ask the question, why AGU? Why are they interested in water management? Because after all, AGU is about science, and the science of good water management is already known. The idea being that it's just about political will. It's just about implementation. And what I can tell you is that those of us on the Water and Society Committee, we reject that premise. The idea that it's just about implementation. The idea of that is similar to saying that writing is just about implementation. The words are all known, and novels are just about implementation. In fact, when it comes to good water management, the implementation is the science. And in order to advance water management science in particular requires a different approach than other fields, especially other fields in the physical sciences. And that's an approach that relies on collaboration between not only hydrologists, physical scientists, and engineers, but also political scientists, and even beyond the world of academia and science to close collaboration with practitioners and with policymakers. And this is something that's quite different from other fields, I think. Maybe not all, but where the association with the world of practice is so critical to advancing the science. And this is really our purview at the Water and Science or Water and Society Committee. I'd like to encourage those of you who work in this field to join us in this endeavor of improving water management science, and those of you who seek solutions to support us. And that is a group under the AGU hydrology section, newly formed Water and Society Committee, which I chair. You can easily get in contact with me for more questions about that. All right, so that is the introduction to our session. I'm very happy to say that we have exemplars in the field of the science of water management here to speak today. We'll start off with Brad Udall. He's the director of the Western Water Assessment, which is a NOAA RESA at the University of Colorado. He's also a principal investigator in 2 recently launched climate science centers of the Department of Interior. His expertise includes hydrology and related policy issues of the American West, and that's what he'll talk about today.
Thank you all for finding your way up to the upper room here. How many of you have seen this map here that Reclamation issued in about 2002, potential water supply crisis by 2025? Quick show of hands. All right, if you remember this was done without any climate change overlay. And so today I'm going to talk about 3 of the areas on this map. I'm going to talk about the Klamath up here. I'm going to talk about the Sacramento San Joaquin right here, and of course the Colorado River Basin. Originally I wanted to throw in the Rio Grande, but in 10 or 15 minutes, a little hard to get to 3, let alone 4 of these basins. So let's talk about the Klamath. Here's this Klamath Basin, sits on the border of Oregon and California. It's relatively tiny. It's about 1/10 or less the size of the Colorado River, yet has the flow of the Colorado River. It's the 3rd largest river on the American West. The 2nd largest is the Sacramento San Joaquin, and I'll leave it as a geography quiz for you to figure out what the 1st largest is, and it was on that previous map. An early reclamation project in 1905 made the upper basin here available for farming, and shortly thereafter Theodore Roosevelt declared, over time, 7 different wildlife refuges were declared in the area. There are 6 dams on this system, including 4 on the river and then 2 in this upper basin. It is a highly modified system, and I think that's one of the things you'll see about all 3 of these systems, the Colorado and the Sacramento San Joaquin. They're 4 endangered fish. There are 6 different tribes with reserved rights under the Winner's Doctrine to water. There was a 2001 drought that led to about 0 allocations to the farmers and to an amazing standoff between reclamation and these farmers who were quite upset. The following year saw a fish kill in the lower basin with about 30,000 dead salmon that raised eyebrows. There are multiple federal agencies involved in this river, including reclamation, of course, but the National Marine Fisheries Service and the NMFS, NOAA NMFS. There were 45 different stakeholder groups that signed an agreement in 2010 to determine the future of the basin. There were NRC reports, which I use as a proxy for how involved or how interested the world is in the basin in 2002, 2004, 2008, and those reports were highly critical of the science being done by reclamation and by NMFS. And right now is a draft EIS was released that would support the removal of 4 dams, the largest dam removal project in the history of the United States. And here's what these solutions look like. And I'll note, if you're really interested in this, this 2008 article here by Matt Jenkins in High Country News is absolutely worth a read. I think it lays out what the future of water negotiation in the West looks like. This was a much smaller basin, but potentially the techniques that went on here could be applied to these other basins. There are 2 major agreements, one to restore the basin itself, and there are 3 parts to that: to rebuild the fisheries, sustainable communities, and there's about $100 million a year in implementation funding. And then there's this, of course, hydroelectric settlement agreement with the 45 signatories to remove the 4 dams. Best guess right now, $300 million to get those dams out of there, which is significantly less than the original $1 billion that they thought when the agreements were being made. And I think the EIS comment period runs through June. All right, let's move to the Sacramento-San Joaquin. And in particular, the Bay Delta. So here's the Sacramento, here's the San Joaquin, and the Bay Delta sits right here. A little aerial Google map photograph right here is the Bay Delta. It's a tiny little area, 25 by about 50 miles. And there are now about 75 islands, so-called islands in this area. Jay Lund at the University of California, Davis, has an interesting little essay on how bad our nomenclature is in this area. He says we need to go to the Dutch to actually properly describe what's going on here, because they're not islands at all, they're polders. Polders are areas below sea level, and polders are surrounded by dikes, yet we say islands surrounded by levees. And if you know the difference, a levee is something that holds back water on occasion. A dike holds back water all the time. And to top it all off, this is not a delta at all in the conventional sense of a sediment-built delta. It's a confluence of 2 rivers, and much of the material here is biological in origin. If you discount the almost 1 cubic kilometer of material that was put there by the hydraulic miners in California in the late 1800s. So let me go back here. We got 1,100 miles of sinking levees. Some of these islands are 15 feet below sea level, and the real fear in this area is that you get what's called the big gulp, that these levees fail due to sea level rise, subsidence, an earthquake, and an enormous amount of seawater out of the Bay Delta itself comes into this area and threatens the movement of 70% of California's water from north to south and salinizes the entire system. There are 2 major projects there, one state, one federal, that move water. There are 4 endangered species, plus a whole bunch of other threatened ones. Again, highly modified. Reclamation has a huge federal presence. And that whole Delta area actually is an infrastructure hub. There are major interstates in the area, there are rail lines, there are natural gas lines, and now we're even building housing right at sea level in this area. So what are the solutions? Well, one idea is the peripheral canal, which was defeated in 1982 by 90% of the voters in Northern California. People have thought about strengthening levees, abandoned some islands. Here's an island that they've actually abandoned a while ago when the levees failed on it. Do we reduce water deliveries? There are 3 NRC reports since 2010. And the latest one says co-equal goals of water supply reliability and environmental protection, as in state law right now, are not compatible and hard decisions must be made. But no one to date is willing to make them. The judge who oversees the endangered species has been very critical of the biological work done in this area. In fact, calling out from the bench recently 2 different federal biologists. And I'll note I was in Commissioner Connor's the office recently. I asked him what he's spending his time on. He said 3 things in this order. 1, our budget. 2, the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. He was getting on a plane the next day to go out there for yet another meeting. And the Colorado River, which is a really nice segue to the Colorado. Huge system, upper basin and lower basin. Water used by every major southwestern city in the basin or not. So pipeline into Los Angeles and San Diego. Salt Lake City now uses water. Denver in the Front Range in some year, 50% of the water there comes out of the Colorado system. Albuquerque recently decided that they would get off unsustainable groundwater and move to Colorado River water via a diversion here on the Rio Chama. There are about 30 million or 35 million people that depend on this system, a whole bunch of irrigated acreage, and it's both overused and overallocated. The best way to describe the overuse is the state of Arizona in this project right here, the Central Arizona Project Canal, now uses about 1.6 million acre feet a year, and 1.2 of that is subject to curtailment in the long run because it's being borrowed from the upper basin. Either climate change or increased upper basin use ultimately will put Arizona's 75% of the Cap Canal at risk. And in the case of the upper basin, so the 4 states here, Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, those states now don't know how much water they have due to a fluke in the compact, this 1922 agreement. Most people think it's the most complicated legal environment in the world. There are tribal reserve water rights. There are all kinds of environmental issues, including no water to the mouth in Mexico since the mid-1990s. There are a bunch of endangered fish. And of all these systems, the climate change models indicate future declines are likely, maybe on the order of 10 to 20% by 2050. And the risk of tree ring mega droughts is well known. And I'll mention some interesting work, science work of dust on snow impacts that we think we're losing about 5% of the flow due to European settlement since 1850 and disturbance to land use. So what about the solutions? So I'll mention this basin study, which is a reclamation and Colorado Basin State option study underway. Recently, the folks in this study submitted the states and anybody who wanted to submitted an option and strategy for dealing with this imbalance. And here's the imbalance. Here's demand over time, 10-year running average going back to 1920, and here's supply. And that is a problem, right? You can never have demand exceed supply in the long run. Because the Colorado system has so much storage, you can do it in the short run, but you can't do it in the long run. And here's a little reclamation chart that raised eyebrows recently showing this demand and supply imbalance to increase. Here are these options that came in. 31% of people gave them supply-oriented options, which include some crazy things such as pipelines from the Mississippi and towing icebergs. 36% were demand-oriented, how do you do conservation, and 33% management. There's a whole bunch of things going on in the basin right now, a desal plant in San Diego, water transfers out of ag, land fouling. We're lining canals in the largest irrigation district in the whole system in Imperial. We've built small reservoirs to try and minimize operational spills. There's some interstate water banking and even large pipelines, including one out of northeastern Nevada into Las Vegas and one that's proposed, and one through Wyoming into the Front Range of Colorado. So I've given you these 3 different case studies, right? And they all total look like train wrecks. I would suggest that we have 3 different kind of interesting progressions going on. The Klamath is actually well on its way to an interesting solution. A much smaller basin. It took 5+, 8+ years of talk to get there. The Sacramento-San Joaquin is a disaster waiting to happen. It is potentially a Fukushima-like economic impact. After Katrina happened, FEMA and others started looking around the country for the next New Orleans-like event, and this place, Sacramento-San Joaquin, has certainly been signaled out as where that might happen. So we got 3 different basins. We got the Colorado with this future imbalance that needs to be dealt with. These basins are all highly modified. Going back to natural is not an option. And I'd point out that in this conference, I've heard lots of talk about climate change. And I would argue that these problems exist here and now, not because of climate change, but because of all kinds of other factors. Climate change is going to make this worse for sure, but they're here and now, and it's not a real big deal in many of these issues. It takes forever to resolve these things. Federal funding's limited, and infrastructure solutions range from removal, like the Klamath dams, to additions like pipelines, as in the peripheral canal in California, or perhaps other sources in the Colorado. So what about solutions? I would argue we need to move away in the West from this idea of consumptive use as a sole metric. We need to find substitutes for water wherever possible, and sometimes cash is in fact a substitute. Cash can also substitute for infrastructure improvements that allow you to use less water and become more efficient. I spent 4 months in Australia last year, and they have an amazing number of things going on with regard to water reform. It goes back 20 years. They're buying 20% of the water in the Murray-Darling from willing sellers for environmental purposes. Full cost pricing is part of their mechanism. They had $3 billion in water market transactions last year, $15 billion in desal plants in Australia over the last 5 years. Conservation they're doing on the scale that people in the American West say we can't do, at about 40 gallons per person per day, and a lot of infrastructure modernization. And then finally, because this is a science policy conference, not one on science or one on policy, but science policy, I thought I'd mention some solutions. In the water realm, science is critical to these solutions, but it's often uncertain. Biological modeling is perhaps the most uncertain of things we do. We need to convey the uncertainties and the error bounds. Scientists used to do experiments. Now we sometimes just do modeling, and we seem to do it just because we can, not because it's the best thing to do. Adaptive management really is all about experiments, and is a part of the climate solution, and is a part of almost any of these solutions that are proposed. At the end of the day, these water solutions are heavily influenced by values, more so than almost anything else, and we just need to acknowledge this. And weak science frequently gets used to try and prop up stakeholder values. Endangered Species Act is a horribly blunt tool, and not a very good tool for this era. We can deal with habitat, we can do science around habitat, but doing it around species is quite difficult. And I'll throw out another one that is a burr under my craw, which is we need to get the open access journals in this community. We are doing science as it was done in the 17th century. There is no reason not to have open access journals. We need to figure out how to do it to protect the revenues and the integrity of the people who produce journals, but we need to get our science out there in a way that decision makers and the public can look at it. If it's not good enough for them, it shouldn't be good enough for us. It should be public and open and out. And I'll leave you with Peter Cullen, who's an Australian scientist. His quote, "I have always felt that knowledge was better than ignorance, and we should try knowledge in this country because ignorance hasn't gotten us very far." Thank you.
Next, we have Professor Ben Hobbs from the Whiting School of Engineering at Johns Hopkins University. He's the Theodore and Kay Shad Chair of Environmental Management. He's also the Director of the Environment, Energy, Sustainability, and Health Institute. Ben.
So my message here is the opposite of what was said of Vienna at the end of World War I. The situation here is desperate but not serious. So in terms of power and water conflicts, I think there are serious problems, but it's not desperate. I don't think a train wreck is at all inevitable, and in fact, I think there are reasons for optimism that I will explain here. One of my other hats is I chair the Market Surveillance Committee for the California Power Market. We've been putting it back together for the last 10 years. In case you haven't noticed, there's been no news about it because it's been working. But we face some real challenges in the California market because of water. The state of California is moving towards basically shutting down most of the once-through cooling plants, including a number of plants in the Delta, that these are the same plants that are going to be critical to integrate wind resources because these plants can move up and down quickly, and that's what you need if you're going to have 33% roughly renewable energy that we are shooting for in California by the year 2020. So we need this flexible capacity, and we're losing it all, and it's because of a water issue. And likewise, in the longer term, we might lose a lot of our even more flexible capacity, hydro capacity, because of climate change. But I don't think the situation is desperate. So here's a little bit of hyperbole that that I won't agree with, but it's the sort of language that's sometimes used for power and water conflicts. And so imagine if Teddy Roosevelt was able to warn his cousin back at the turn of the century that, gee, the Dust Bowl was happening. Well, these authors say we're able to predict the same sort of disaster coming because of a combination of population growth, rising electricity demand and drought, and building more conventional power plants is threatens to cause massive shortages of waters, and we could have power shortages as well because of problems. So we need an executive order. We can't wait for Congress to act. We need an executive order to respond to this. I think the situation is not desperate. It is serious, but it's not like this. And I'm going to give some reasons for optimism. And I'm going to illustrate that reason by going back 35 years ago, when these problems were also thought about. And indeed, then we thought it was very, very serious. So this is a scenario of the power plant siting mix and water use that I helped put together as part of the National Coal Utilization Assessment. President Carter wanted us to use a lot more coal. Natural gas was in shortage. And we came up with scenarios like this, showing a large number of floating nuclear power plants bobbing off the coast of New Jersey. 2 of these were actually on order. 1 was under construction. And then a raft of coal-fired power plants in western Pennsylvania. And the water consequences of all these nukes here in the Delaware River Basin and all these coal plants in western Pennsylvania, in the Ohio Basin, there would have been very severe conflicts, and that's what we were quite afraid of. Oh, here's a cute little batch of 4 plants in the Potomac as well. These would cause massive problems, but there were a couple assumptions here that weren't terribly good. One was that the demand growth rate for electricity would go at 3.5% a year, doubling every 2 decades. And the second was the future of power plants were highly water consumptive nukes and coal plants. And neither of those are true. Here's a bunch of energy demand forecasts for the U.S. economy made back in '75. Note the scale has been cut off, but some of them show a tripling of energy demand by the year 2000. What actually happened was this. So electricity demand grew at 1% a year, not 3.5% or 7% per year. And we're going to see 1% a year in the future, not these massive growth rates. So we're not getting pressure from the demand side, and neither are we going to get pressure on the supply side because the technologies are changing. In particular, the amount of water consumed by new power plants is generally a lot less than the old ones. And furthermore, we're building national or regional power markets, which are enabling us to move power great distances more easily. It's hard to move water, maybe almost impossible to move water. But if you can move power, then at least in the long term, you can build power plants where this is not such a problem. Use coastal water, build dry cooling plants, and so forth. So serious, but not desperate. There are, of course, local pinch points. We get high temperatures and we have to derate power plants. This is Browns Ferry in Alabama last summer. Or I was on vacation in the Loire Valley of France and they had to shut down one of their nukes because they didn't have enough water. When the power plant stock turns over, you can site them more intelligently. I mentioned the once-through cooling rule that's going to shut down a lot of California capacity. Well, at the same time, we're also shutting down 10-year-old dry-cooled combined cycle plants because there isn't the market for their power. We can solve this problem by better power market design, and we're working on that. We can also solve it by better or having some water market design as well to move water around, as Brad was just talking. And of course, groundwater contamination is a huge worry with fracking. We had a big session yesterday about that. The state regulators are not asleep at the job. They're not even on the job, given the drastic budget cuts in, for example, Pennsylvania's environmental regulator. And that's a real concern because that stuff's irreversible. Water consumption is reversible. You can scrap the plants, but groundwater contamination is not. And I'll mention a little bit about climate change. Okay, some perspective on energy use. So this is an alarming picture where half of all water diversions, withdrawals in the U.S. roughly, are for thermal power cooling, But most of that is fed right back. Only a very small fraction of this is consumed. And actually a third of this is salt water. So compared to other uses in general nationally, thermal power plants aren't very much. And this will quite likely shrink in the future as we scrap our coal plants. So that's the national picture. Of course, local picture is very different. All water politics are necessarily local because it's hard to move water very far. Hope for technology. This shows water consumption both for cooling, the red, and then upstream in fuel production. So for example, gas combined cycle, you can hardly see it, but the water that's used in fracking natural gas is about 1/100th of the water that is consumed by evaporative cooling towers. So at any rate, the old technologies, we're going to be retiring a lot of coal plants in the next 10 years because of air rules mainly, use a lot of water. The newer technologies, gas combined cycle using dry cooling especially, wind, and others don't use near as much. Geothermal, of course, can, but that's not going to be very widespread. That's going to be more local. This doesn't mean there aren't issues locally at certain places, but I think the general picture is shrinking water use in the future for the power sector, with the possible exception of if we have widespread deployment of carbon sequestration. If that's the case, a lot of water is used in that process. We will be building more gas plants, if nothing else, to back up the wind. So on an annual basis, it might not be a lot of water, but of course, in the summer, when perhaps the wind's not blowing as hard, when demands are higher and water is scarcest, maybe when we need this water the most. Okay, so in water, in general, we're not going to see water coming from Alaska down to the Colorado Basin. We're not going to see it going from the Great Lakes. It's darn hard to do large interbasin transfers. You mentioned that your father was able to do it, but I don't think we'll see that duplicate in the future. But in power, we're going to see a lot more interregional transfers in the future. This map is from a great Union of Concerned Scientists report on water use and the power sector, and identifies roughly 1/5 of U.S. basins have water stress if you compare water use versus water supply. And of those basins, about 20% of those have a lot of power use. So the darker areas are places where power use of water is significant relative to local supply. I should point out that, first of all, there are 3 major interconnections in the U.S. that can, in theory, you can move power from Key West to Maine, although, of course, you have local transmission constraints. And we have 7 major power markets. The one I work with, California, and actually includes part of Nevada right now as well in the east. Power can basically be moved through there, at least on an annual basis, you can move it the length and breadth, and then you have transfers across there. So if you have a water problem with power in a particular place, in the long run, you can build power plants elsewhere. Now, we do have these local pinch points. I mentioned fracking, I mentioned the ones through cooling retirements, and I mentioned climate change. In California, we may lose a lot of our hydropower production. You mentioned Jay Lund. He's actually studied this in quite some detail. Under some climate scenarios, we'll get more hydro, and others will get less, because downscaling climate scenarios is so hard. But if we look at the variation in hydropower output in California in the last 30 years, you can say the minimum is about the half of the maximum, roughly. And if we tend to be more down here, that will cause problems. Indeed, it was a drought in the 2000 that helped to kick off the California power crisis. So we'll need to deal with that, but we can see it coming. We can build new plants. We can keep the plants that we have that are retiring. We can keep those from retiring. Climate change will also provide some stresses in terms of increasing peak electricity demands, precisely at the time that you don't have so much water, so perhaps 3 to 5% under a doubling of CO2. And at the same time, the efficiency of power plants will decrease. This shows the efficiency of open cycle combustion turbines. These provide our peaking power. Their output decreases with temperature, and likewise their fuel use per unit of power increases, so we worsen greenhouse gas emissions precisely when temperatures are going higher. That's for open cycle combustion turbine air-cooled, and this is for water-cooled thermal plants, and this is their efficiency. This is their output as the cooling water inlet temperature goes up. So you might lose 2, 3, 4% of your capacity due to higher temperatures. relative to the present day climate, that's 2 to 4 years worth of demand growth. That will cause some stress. That will be a serious problem, but not a desperate one. So with that, I'll conclude saying basically the problems that we have now, this too will pass, and we'll be able to manage it, especially if we have more flexible power markets and water markets. Thank you.
Next up, we have Gerry Galloway. Gerry is the Glenn L. Martin Institute Professor of Engineering at the University of Maryland and also an affiliate professor of public policy at the University of Maryland. He, among other things, consults around the world on water policy and engineering, large engineering projects. He served in the U.S. Army for 38 years, retiring as a brigadier general and dean of academics at West Point. He's a member of the National Academy of Engineering, a fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration.
It's a great pleasure to be here today and to talk about, I'm a policy wonk, for lack of a better term. I'm interested in what are we going to do and where have you gone, Joe DiMaggio? Now, how many of you even know where that line came from? Well, that's pretty good. If those of you who haven't, get the movie The Graduate, and Mrs. Robinson is the song from that. And the question is, Joe DiMaggio is our hero, and water policy has been necessary at various times in our nation's history. Where has it gone? And what are we doing about it? I'm going to very quickly talk to you about the major water challenges we face. I think you all know this is one of these, like the convention of comedians. We say number one and everybody laughs because they know what that one is. In our case, we have some big challenges, starting with the fact that we've got a 21st century that's a lot different than the 20th century was, with population, development, scarce resources, knowledge that we don't know how to actually apply. When I go to my university and everything's nano and bio and we see the complexities that are coming, they're not only physical challenges, they're moral, ethical challenges, they're intellectual challenges, and then the whole idea of this complex, ambiguous world that surrounds us. So what are we talking about? We're talking about a climate change, as we've heard twice already, that's going to have some impact on us. We'll just stipulate, I won't argue about when it's going to happen, what's going to happen. We're going to have something happen, so we have to deal with that. Look at this list of water challenges that we face, that things that you all see on a day-to-day basis, whether it's drought and water demand, which Brad has talked about, the water quality issues that are connected with many of the things we do, including fracking, flood damages going up every year, ports, harbors, waterways, new Panamax, post-Panamax canal that's going to change the way our cargo moves in this country and moves in the international circles, and go through all of these, whether it's the environment, the restoration of the environmental damages, or you go to these sorts of things, the water-energy nexus that Ben just talked about. We're talking about, are we really protecting groundwater? What are we doing about that? Look at all of these sorts of issues and say, wow, that's a lot. And who is looking this whole thing over, and where are we going with it? How are we addressing these challenges? In 2001, 10 federal agencies came to the American Water Resources Association and said, what's our water policy? Now, this is kind of strange. When federal agencies say, what are we supposed to be doing? They were at the level below the administration. They were below the political level, typically, although there were some political appointees involved in the funding of this. And they asked the AWRA to run a dialogue to bring together people to discover and talk about what's the challenge out there. And they held one in 2002, another one in 2005 in the West in Tucson, and then came back to Washington in 2007 to sort of sum it up and say, what actions could we take? There was actually a fourth one right before the election, the last presidential election, to inform both of the parties on what the issues were. What came out of this National Water Policy Dialogue? Well, not a lot of action, to be honest with you. It was one of those things where you go to your mailbox every day and look for the response, but a letter was sent to the President of the United States and to the governors telling them these are the issues. It was also sent to the Senate Majority Leader, the Speaker of the House. It was sent in 2002, again in 2005, and then this was the third one. And in reality, we did get calls back from these different agencies and different people. But it starts off with saying the way we're running water in this country is dysfunctional. That ought to be enough to incentivize people to say, what are we going to do about that? How are we going to handle the mix of challenges we have and how we're going to manage those challenges? The second part of this was, our nation's approach to dealing with this issue. Our nation's approach is a management by earmark. We've heard a lot about that. We've seen it from the fiscal side, but when you realize that, for example, the Corps of Engineer budget is essentially nothing but line item that's either earmarked by the administration in terms of specific projects or earmarked by the committees of the Congress without any consideration of the broader aspects that are both within the multiple uses of water across agencies other than the Corps of Engineers or in terms of what a watershed itself, a geographic area, is dealing with. So there are some challenges. And then in 2009, Jim Oberstar, who was the chairman of the House T&I Committee, Transportation and Infrastructure, which writes the Water Resource Development Act, made this statement, which I think is interesting. It's also interesting that he lost the next election in 2010. I don't think because of this statement, but it was very clear that here was a man with a vision that said, in effect, policy is ad hoc, implementation is decentralized, coordination is fragmented. That's not a ringing endorsement from the single most important man in the water business for water policy in the United States House of Representatives. He had tried to get help from the other committees. He tried to get help from the other side of the Capitol, from the Senate, and found it totally impossible to do. We've got to look at water planning. How are we thinking? We live in a world where still today, if you go to many federal projects and many ideas as people are formulating the future, we're going to short-term, what we call the cylindrical, stationarity, everything's going to be like it was in the past with the focus on economics. Imagine looking through this pipe and you look out 50 years and what do you see? You see the same thing you see today. Whereas, as Mark Weige from Denver Water posted in this particular slide, the future is conical. We're going to have all these scenarios out there about which we know very little. And so how do we plan for this very uncertain future? How do we deal with non-stationarity? And at the same time, remember that in the last 100 years, we weren't very sustainable. In the next 100 years, we better be sustainable. So that's a challenge. The other challenge is where decision makers focus. They're focused on the next election. They're focused on the next balance sheet. So how do you get people to stretch their horizon from 5 to 30 or 50 years? That's the challenge. What we need is a vision. Now, you all know this gentleman. And he said, if you don't know where you're going, every road will get you nowhere. Now, that's very erudite. On another level, my friend Yogi Berra looked at it from a different perspective and said, you might not get there if you don't know where you're going. So there's some challenges that we face. If you don't have a vision, what do we expect? And I'd ask you, I'd love to have the time to say, write on a piece of paper what you think our national vision is for water. This has been debated, it's been discussed several times in some committees of the Congress, but when it gets to the difficult part, people just move on. What's missing, unless we look at this jumble of laws and regulations, committee guidance, all of these sorts of things, we don't have any national policy. We don't have a national vision, and these things don't seem to be coming as we move forward. And do we need them? Well, I would argue that we certainly do. Sound water management is going to depend on us having some sort of a vision of how we want to integrate the various things that both Brad and Ben have talked about. How do we deal with the Delta when it's not only a water supply, a water quantity, a water quality, it's a flood control issue. It can go on from there. How are we going to deal with the future if we don't know how they collectively fit together? Our goals and objectives, who's responsible? We've had various groups given responsibility, but they've all disappeared. So where is the policy and what do we expect? I'm going to give you quickly some examples. Let's take the Mississippi River, the basin itself. 31 states in the U.S., 2 provinces of Canada, 41% of the geographic region of the lower 48. So it's a big area. And what are we doing about it? Well, let's take the example of hypoxia. If you were lucky, you heard Nancy Rabelais talk about the hypoxia issue. I'm not going to get into the science. All I've got to say is that there's hypoxia at the mouth of the Mississippi. It's a challenge. Where does it come from? It comes from material that comes from the upper Midwest. It's farming. It's very important to our nation. The National Academy was asked to study this. What can we do about it? What should we do about it? They said we can identify the contributors, we can establish goals for reduction, allocate these targets, and implement. And how long is it going to take before we see the first indication that something's changed? 10 years. And what's been done since they did the study 2 years ago? Nothing. That's an interesting challenge. Let's look at the Missouri Basin. That's an interesting one. How do we manage the Missouri? Nothing could be more interesting than looking at what happened last year on the Missouri. This was a 2004 National Academy report looking at how we preserve the ecosystem, how we keep all of the endangered species alive, and how we keep the other species alive. And the bottom line in this report, which went to the Congress, went to the Secretary of the Interior, said we're managing through an accretion of laws and regulations that don't give us what we want as the final result. A very, very difficult situation. And Congress, you ought to do something about it. Last November, after the big floods, I watched congressmen from the upstream states and the downstream states sit on the platform in the committees of Congress and argue with each other about who had the rights to more water. They can't solve that. That's a very difficult situation. The ecosystem is in danger, and the economic viability of that basin is in danger. So we have all of these dams. What are they doing? They're also creating problems for sediment. They're trapping, is it 40, is it 30, is it 50% of the sediment of the Mississippi Basin? Why is that important if they're trapped? Well, we have no means of passing it through right now. The Chinese are struggling with this, by the way, at the same time. But those of us who work in Louisiana find that we need a lot of that sediment to restore the delta. And if you can't restore the delta, then we're going to have more flood control problems, we're going to have ecosystem problems, and we're going to endanger 35% of the nation's oil and gas industry. So there is a link between what goes on upstream and what goes downstream, and what goes in the northern part of the U.S. and the southern part, and we have to be thinking about those as a system. So we've got to define what we need, we've got to seek the solutions, and we've got to implement, but there's no mechanism for doing that. We've had criteria for deciding what's a good project, what's a bad project. In '65, in the days of coming out of the Kennedys' push for a broader approach to dealing with water projects where we considered social and environmental and cultural, other things besides pure economics, we came up with the Water Resource Planning Act, which said we'll have principles and standards that have 4 accounts in them. Well, in 1983, in the Reagan administration, James Watt threw those out and said we have only one national goal, and that's national economic development. Since 1983, there's been a continuous battle over that, and everyone has agreed it's put us in the wrong direction, or almost everybody has agreed. In 2007, in the Water Resource Development Act, we came up with the need for a new way of looking at it, and the Congress asked for policy. 5 years later, we have no new policy. Directed that this be done, it hasn't been done. We've got flood problems in this country. We've got an act that goes back to 1936. It was designed for an entirely different situation. We've got levels of protection that were established initially at a very high level, and now today they're at a lower level, and what we end up with is other nations of the world are much better protected, much more attuned to dealing with the challenges they face. Just imagine the Dutch have 10,000-year protection on their coastlines, and in New Orleans we turned out to have about 80-year protection. Lots of problems with that, tight economics, environmental, cost-sharing, national flood insurance program, all of those are policy-oriented. We started off high, and we ended up low in these various terms. We asked in a report of 1994 for somebody to do something about this, for a Floodplain Management Act. It keeps being looked at, but nobody does anything about it. The dialogue said we need principles, we need vision, we need to implement that vision into policies, and we need to encourage policies that promote watershed planning, but most important of all, we need to make sure our science is well considered in the things we do. The very things that you've heard throughout this entire conference. Are things happening? Well, this is a 2009 report by the Corps of Engineers called National Report Responding to National Water Resource Challenges. It's all about collaboration. Foster continued dialogue, get people together, get the states and the localities and the federal government working off the same sheet of music. But you need that sheet of music. There has been one attempt. The Corps of Engineers came up with a vision for the Mississippi Basin, a 200-year vision. How do you like that? Who signed it? Actually, only federal agencies signed it. There's no buy-in from the states. There's no buy-in from the federal government. But it was a noble attempt, and it's still out there. Will it go somewhere? Just depends. Somebody is trying to do something. We want to sustain the Mississippi River, then we need to have a unified vision of where we want to go. Last year, in April of last year, the administration put out this water framework, and included in there is the statement that we need to maintain strong and clear standards, and we need to deal with investments in federal projects in a more systemic way. We need to have better policies for water resources. Again, nothing has been done. Is this impossible? Not really. The European Union has a water framework directive. Now, they had 27 nations at the time they passed this, and they were able to agree that 27 different countries could agree to create basin plans, that they would coordinate them, they'd work together to solve that. They also have subsidiary directives that deal with such things as water for human consumption, marine environment, and at the bottom, how they deal with flooding. They have a requirement among all nations to have a mapping of flood risk. Very important. China's got a new water policy for quality, and they're working on them for flood and water allocation. Well, what's the problem? The problem is that we've got something called a water box, and this comes out of the World Water Development Report. The bottom line with this particular diagram, the 2009 report says, we're not communicating. Those of us who are down here dealing with water on a day-to-day basis are running around solving our problems, whereas the people that are influencing the big decisions, the civil society actors, businesses, and the political actors are not listening to us, and we're not listening to them. So how do we get them together? We in the water box have got to get our act together. We've got to communicate with these people. In the 2012 report of the World Water Assessment Program, they said there's semi-universal agreement that there is this communication problem. So what are we going to do with it? I'll end with this. What do we have to do? We as scientists have to become involved. We have to really be worried about informing people of the technical issues and getting the technical issues just as my two colleagues discussed with you. We've got to educate other people about what's going on, and we've got to have the nerve to stand up and say when something is really bad. And more times that's happening. We are less afraid to get into the political environment and stand up at a public meeting and say, that's just not right. We can do it. We can make a difference. But scientists and those in the science world are going to have to become, instead of bystanders, participants in the decision process. Thank you very much.